Tonight, the federal Liberal Party's moved to the centre, exposing factional divides.
Trioli, welcome to Q&A. Here to answer your questions tonight, Cabinet Insider, Leader of the House and self-declared fixer, Christopher Pyne, American pollster and political analyst Anna Greenberg, who's visiting Australia for Sydney University's US Studies Centre, Alastair Campbell, the archetypal hard-hitting spin doctor who advised Tony Blair, the Shadow Minister for Justice Clare O'Neill, and John Howard's longtime confidant and advisor, Grahame Morris. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live on ABC TV and radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time, and you can stream us live on iView, YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. Our first question comes from Terry Helen Gaynor.
Over the weekend, the Australian Treasurer Scott Morrison was quoted in a variety of outlets as saying that our politicians need to open themselves up and to be more authentic with voters if they are to avoid you know what I mean, annihilation. The next election must not be fought on partisan political grounds, but on authenticity. So, Alastair Campbell, given recent election events in the US and the UK, and your views on political strategy, or lack thereof, of those particular campaigns, do you agree with the Treasurer, and how would you be advising our politicians moving forward to electoral time?
Well, the only trouble with that question is that if you're having to advise somebody about how to be authentic, then that suggests they're unlikely to be authentic. Look, most politicians are authentic. They get a very, very hard time from their media, from their publics. And what's more, people say that they want politicians to kind of, you know, just work together and be part of a team and all that sort of stuff. But their parties and governments, there are competing interests within them. You're always going to get that. What I think is true is that the politicians who are really breaking through at the moment, and not necessarily for good, Donald Trump being the most obvious, is that there's a danger, I think, that what we mean by authenticity is actually people who are just kind of, you know, a bit weird and loud-mouthed. And I think that Donald Trump, in a way, is a metaphor for this, because there's the guy who really came to kind of major prominence. He's been prominent in the States for a long time, but the thing that really took him to a different level was actually the I'm a Celebrity, the Apprentice show. And he's a metaphor because in the world of reality TV, we've now got a reality TV president who's actually governing as though it's a show. So, for example, when he was appointing the cabinet, he was putting out tweets saying, only I know who the contestants are for the top jobs. Right. Now, that's authentically him, but do you want him as president?
So you'd actually rather that he played a bit more of a role as politician?
I would rather that I'd rather he'd never been elected. I think he's a disaster for America, but I do think he's a disaster for politics because I think that it's signal. But in the end, the public have got to decide what they want their politicians to be. Okay. At the moment, Theresa May is getting a lot of flack. Now, I think rightly for some of the decisions that she's made, but people, they want their politicians to be kind of a bit of showbiz and a bit of glamour. They've got to be politicians. They've got to be leaders. And what we're doing is we're making it almost impossible for politicians to step up and to become leaders and then to lead.
Well, let's hear from the rest of our panel on this. Anna Greenberg, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask because what I do for a living is help candidates shape their message to appeal to voters. So I'm sort of one of those spin doctors, yes. But what I say to my candidates is you have to tell me who you are, what you care about, what your values are. I'll help you find a way to say it, but I'm not going to make something up because voters can see right through that. Donald Trump is authentically him. He's all id. He reacts to the last thing he's heard, the last thing he's seen. The last thing he saw on Fox and Friends. I think the last world leader he talked to, he decided he was his friend, no matter what our actual national interests are. But I do think that ultimately what will happen is for people who really thought he was going to help them, which I hear in focus groups all the time, he's going to bring back jobs when he gets rid of free trade deals, he cares about people. When they see things like what's going to happen with healthcare, which right now is a complete and utter disaster, and the Senate is on the cusp of possibly throwing out, health insurance for 24 million people, I think that's also authentically him, and I think that he will pay the consequence for it.
Christopher Pyne, do you agree with your colleague, Scott Morrison?
Well, I do agree with Scott Morrison, because it's not all about Donald Trump. He's certainly very well known in the country, but in the world. But for our country, I think what Scott Morrison's trying to convey is what a lot of politicians understand today, and that the last 10 years in Australia, since the Howard government, has been a pretty tumultuous time. We've had 4 Prime Ministers and 5 changes of Prime Minister in 10 years. We've had 2 changes of government. And we've had a lot of anti-stories about politicians, about governments, about the West. And we feel very threatened in the West because of the international insecurity that we feel. And those people from London and so on have obviously had that very much as part of their daily lives. And I think it will take a long time for the public to trust government again as an institution that can solve their problems and meet their concerns. And what I think Scott Morrison's trying to say to people is that we understand that we have to be on the public side. The days of putting together a 3-point plan or a 5-point plan and going out and selling it and spending a whole lot of money at election time with focus groups or whoever it might be, I think the public are really over that, and they really want to know that government's on their side and doing the things that they want the government to do, which is jobs, national security, international security, and that's obviously what the Turnbull government is trying to do.
That sounded like a 3-point plan.
Well, I didn't mean it that way. I mean...
No, it was a 3-point soundbite.
Sorry, my mistake. Clare O'Neill.
Well, I think your question is absolutely right, actually, and I don't agree with Scott Morrison on much, but I do agree with him on this point. I think we're seeing indications, not just in Australia, but all around the world, that there is a collection of people in democracies who want to see something very different from their politicians. And I think any politician who is pretending that this is not happening, any political party that's pretending that this is not happening, is going to be in peril. So one of the really important things that we constantly hear from the public, and we heard it a lot in the UK election, was that people are sick of politicians that sound like robots, that read things ad nauseum off an auto cue, that say the same line again and again, no matter what question they're being asked. And I do think it's time for politicians to stop being like this. This is what the public are telling us that they want. So one of the things I think is important in this is for people like Chris and myself to start being a bit more fluent about talking about our values and the things that motivate and drive us in politics. Because I think when you take that out of the conversation, what a lot of you in the audience are seeing of politics is all of the infighting and the bickering and the kind of aggression that goes on without a lot of insight into what's driving the people behind it. And I think we can do a lot better at that.
Grahame Morris, Christopher Pyne just referenced John Howard, who may have been, I guess, maybe the last Prime Minister we had who was genuinely that authentic person. Was he the last authentic Prime Minister? He certainly, in all the many interviews I did with him, he certainly would always answer that question and never rely on sound bites.
Yeah, that's true, but it's a different world. The media now, you're talking about values, and I agree with you on values. I think values are really important, that people understand what drives their politicians, what's underneath. But now the TV grabs are down to 6 seconds. Just think about that. Mr Turnbull, tell us about your values. Well, I have a number of... Oh, sorry, cut. It is very difficult now to cut through. And you think the government has actually had a pretty good couple of weeks and on policy, but policy stuff is not coming through. What's cut through in the last 6 months? All the terrorism stuff, fires in London. Not necessarily, hey, the government had a week on education. There is so much now that is driving people and people's attention spans. We've got an entire young generation who think that the Cold War was something that happened last winter, that the Japanese invasion was 4 people who turned up on the Gold Coast. It is an entirely different world, and the politicians, I think you're right, I like the values idea, but I also love this idea of getting rid of the jargon, getting out of Canberra, not going through the press gallery and walking around electorates, doing talkback radio, which to me is a bit more authentic.
Well, can I just say though, just to jump in, just from a perhaps, if I say very respectfully, from a slightly younger perspective. No, I don't mean that disrespectfully at all. It's just that you're talking about the grabs on the news media, and what we know is that there are fewer and fewer people who are tuning into this type of mediated broadcast all the time. And instead, the way that Chris and I are starting to talk to our constituents is actually directly through things like Facebook. And what you find is that when you talk about the things that you care about on Facebook, you can put up a video that might go for a few minutes where you talk about the things that you really value, and thousands of people will watch it. And that's the first time we're the first generation of politician who's been able to have that direct dialogue, and I can see that people are really looking for it.
At the telephone town hall meetings, which I did a couple of those during the election, one with Malcolm, one on my own, where people actually connected. And out of, I think, 40,000 telephone numbers in my electorate, we had about 20-odd thousand in each of them who tuned in. Now, some tuned in for 50 minutes, some tuned in for 5 minutes, but it was very connect-full. And I think you're right. When I first got elected, we did direct mails across the electorate. One of Trump's great successes was finding out the thing that made Alastair tick, and that was the only thing that Trump communicated with Alastair about.
I didn't get it.
No, well,
thank God.
All the other Alastairs in Michigan or wherever else.
That particular connection was not made, though.
And they weren't interested in all the other issues. They were interested in the thing that made them tick, and that's very granular.
Let's move on to the next question, and it comes tonight from Tegan Lebusk.
My question is for Christopher Pyne. Behind closed door, Christopher Pyne has said that same-sex marriage is to be legalised sooner rather than later, a claim that has been rejected by key cabinet members. Will this disagreement within the coalition advance the case of same-sex marriage, or will it hinder it?
Well, I'm in favour of marriage equality. I always have been, so that's not remarkable. And I've said for many years that I want marriage equality in Australia, and I've campaigned for it. And I spoke to a group of supporters, generally, of marriage equality on Friday night and told them what I've said many times before in the media, which is have hope that there will be marriage equality in Australia, that it will come eventually. The only thing that's made that statement remarkable is that there's apparently a secret leaked tape which has excited the press and has turned it into a sensational story. But actually, obviously I support the policy. I want there to be a vote of the people so that they are part of that outcome. That was a policy we put to the Parliament. Labor voted it down. If they'd voted for the plebiscite, we could have had marriage equality in February or March of 2017, because as long as it was carried, the Parliament would have had agreed to pass whatever the people wanted. And I think that's a lost opportunity. That remains our policy, and I support that. But that hasn't changed my fundamental belief in marriage equality now going back from whenever this issue was first raised.
Well, we'll get to Clare O'Neill and Labor in just a moment, but it didn't just excite the press. Christopher Pyne, it excited Tony Abbott, your former leader, as well. He called you disloyal today, and disloyal to him when he was leader, when you said in that tape that you voted for Malcolm Turnbull in every ballot. What's your response to being called disloyal by Tony Abbott?
Well, look, I've been friends with Tony Abbott for a quarter of a century.
Are you still now?
I like to think so, yes. I have won 9 elections with the Liberal banner. I've served in the Cabinet and the leadership group for now a very long period of time. I, along with Peter Credlin, Andrew Hurst, Mark Textor, Julie Bishop, a couple of other people, were absolutely central to him becoming Prime Minister and defeating the Labor Party in 2013 and almost defeating them in 2010. So nobody could ever question my determination to see a coalition government in power, because I believe in the values of the Liberal Party and the National Party about smaller government and individual freedom, national security and international status. Of course, leaders change in political parties. And my vote for Malcolm Turnbull over my whole career is not a secret. But obviously when Tony Abbott was the leader, I got up every morning, usually, as Grahame would remember, at 6 a.m. from when he was working for the leader, to do telephone conference calls every day to work out how we could get rid of the Rudd-Gillard government, and we did. And that was for Tony Abbott, but more than Tony Abbott, it was for the Australian people, because I believe we were getting rid of a bad government and putting in a better one with Tony Abbott as Prime Minister.
Well, I want to get to the other panel, but I did just want to ask you this as well, because given the timing of this and your remarks on Friday night, it's no secret also that your party's divided. You're losing votes to Pauline Hanson. You've got a Conservative group and a more moderate group, which you referenced on Friday night. Cory Bernardi's making off with some of the right as well. Haven't you risked blowing up a very fractured party by being so boastful about your moderates being in the ascendancy?
One of the tremendous things about the Turnbull government is it's very consultative, and Malcolm runs a proper cabinet government, but also
well, you may have just blown that up with those remarks.
But everybody,
that consultative nature.
Everyone in the party room has a say in the outcomes of the Turnbull government on policy, and I think they feel very much part of the team. Obviously, there are issues about which we don't agree, and there are conscience issues where we're not required to agree. Why would we have to agree? That doesn't mean that the government is in some kind of crisis if we have different views. The Labor Party's been bleeding votes to the Greens for decades, and they get by perfectly well. We are, as a political party, facing a whole bunch of different political parties on the non-Labor side of politics. That's happened before too. But in the UK election, the two major parties increased their vote, and actually minor parties lost votes. In France and the Netherlands recently, they both re-elected centre or centre-right governments, not extreme at all.
My question was about the fractures in your party and what this does to them.
Well, look, we're not a Stalinist party. People are allowed to have different views. I support the party's policy on marriage equality, and I'm in favour of marriage equality if I had a vote at the plebiscite. Other people don't share those views in the Liberal Party, or the National Party for that matter. That doesn't mean the party doesn't get along perfectly well in delivering things like education outcomes, education reform, the ABCC, the Registered Organisations Commission, company tax cuts, income tax cuts. We are getting on with the job, and as Grahame said, since the budget, the government is looking in pretty good shape.
Well, let's get Clare O'Neill to answer that question, and I will come to all the members of the panellists in just a moment. Clare O'Neill, the question was specifically about whether the comments as they've been broadcast now actually hinder the case for same-sex marriage.
Well, I think it's been a bit of a challenging 12 hours for the kind of factional welfare in the Liberal Party, but to be totally honest with you, it doesn't interest me at all. I don't care what happens in those conversations. It's got nothing to do with the people that I represent. And I don't want it to get lost that there's a really important subject at the heart of Christopher's comments, and that is whether people who identify as LGBTI in this country are equal before the law. And this is a pretty enormous thing that's happened. We've got a Cabinet Minister here on the panel tonight who's telling us that he wants to see action on this in this Parliament. And I think that's actually exciting, and it's something that we should be happy about. I think marriage equality for a lot of Australians has become emblematic of the inability of people in Canberra to deal with national issues. We've got a majority of Australians that are in favour of this. A majority of parliamentarians are in favour of it. And all we need to do is bring this to a vote in the Parliament. Now, Bill Shorten, our Labor leader, has presented this a bill that will have this effect in the Parliament multiple times. And I want to see a situation where we can bring this to a head and resolve it, because...
But hang on, I need to jump in here. I mean, because if people are being accused of playing politics, that accusation can easily be made of your side of politics, where what you're doing is attempting to wedge the government and to, force a split in the party with Malcolm Turnbull by wanting to have that vote in the Parliament rather than a plebiscite. And it's been perfectly clear that, to many, that the Labor Party in government has been playing that game.
I don't agree that Labor's been playing a game on this at all. This is actually a fundamental issue of the rights of thousands and thousands of Australians and their families to be equal before the law. And this is a pretty fundamental thing to a lot of people who sit in the Labor caucus, and it is not something that we are going to play political games with.
OK.
Now, I think there are really good arguments not to have a plebiscite, and in fact, the LGBTI community came to Labor and said that this is not how we want to resolve this issue. Let's remember here that no matter what happens in a plebiscite, the Parliament is the one that will have to decide
All right,
this.
well, time's on the wing, so I want to move on to Grahame Morris. Grahame?
The Liberal Party and the coalition is a very broad church, and Christopher has his own pew. Where he got into trouble today was the suggestion that the vote would be brought forward. It's not going to be brought forward. And we are a long way away from having this vote, despite what Clare just said. Long way. You cannot have this vote until you sort out who is exempt. Are we going to force the churches to have these marriages? are we going to force the people who make the wedding cakes? Can they opt out? What about somebody who runs a church hall in a country area? Can they opt out? So there are a lot of questions to go, and the idea that this is a lay-down misere and everyone is in favour of it, I still think that if this goes to a plebiscite, yeah, Western Australia, Queensland, Tasmania, they're not going to say yes en masse. And it's almost the sort of my generation up. When it goes, this will be a lay-down misere. But at the moment, it's going to be very, very divisive. And even a close vote is not going to be good enough because there's still going to be half the community and not going to wear it.
All right, let's hear quickly from our overseas visitors. Alastair? This has all been sorted out in the UK.
Well, it's been sorted out in the UK. It's been sorted out in Ireland.
Which
has now got a gay prime minister, so he can get married if he wants to. It's kind of, I find this whole argument a bit weird. I've got to say, my advice: don't have a referendum about anything. because you risk making catastrophic decisions. But I do think and it was interesting to follow on from the first question to hear Christopher speaking there, because all you're seeing is that when it does come to initialise, you have authentic division and authentic differences of opinion. But I can't for the life of me on this issue understand why, if the Prime Minister believes that it's the right thing, and if he thinks, which I would have said all the evidence suggests, whatever the vote might be in this state or that state, that there's a big majority for it, I think you just go for it and do it. And at the end of it, you'll think, why did we have that argument about having a referendum?
Anna?
Well, it's very strange from a US perspective, to be honest with you. We had all of these same arguments about 10 or 15 years ago about what would the churches do and would you have to make a wedding cake for a gay couple. And the Supreme Court, exactly 2 years ago today, made marriage equality the law of the land. And guess what? The sky has not fallen. Gay people are getting married. They're getting the benefits that they should get. They're getting treated equally under the law, except in some states where some people are resisting giving out marriage license. And it really has not created the sorts of problems that I think that our colleague here has talked about. I find it completely bizarre.
Let's move on to our next question now. It comes from Diana Mason.
Given the recent backlash against the two major political parties in France and the rise in election and popularity of characters like Trump and Corbyn, can it be the reality that political landscape in Australia will change as dramatically?
Let's start with you, Alastair.
Well, I don't know about Australia, but I really hope somebody sends the clip of your question to Jeremy Corbyn that he's been put in the same bracket as Donald Trump. He's going to love that. Listen, I find the whole thing weird. But I think it underlines what Clare was saying earlier, that we're just in times of change and turmoil. Now, I actually think that in France, I think Macron actually has shown that that you can win from the centre. He's shown as well that you can stand out against really aggressive populist opinion.
And do you think that was something particular to him and his nature and personality, or to the Times, that he managed to do that?
I think it's down in the end. For all that people say they want the government and the party, he was an individual who showed extraordinary guts in doing what he did, in just saying, do you know what, our politics feels like it's broken, I'm going to do something different. Now, in our system, it's hard to do because we're a parliamentary system. It's easy when he was going straight up for the top job and he did it. But I think what's happened is that populism, to me, isn't about being popular. It's about where we allow emotion to drive decision-making. And the thing that I find so terrifying about Trump in particular, and about the Brexit vote, is actually what the politicians who won that argument, well, they won the vote, what they did was that instead of saying, here's a problem, my job as a political leader is to try to address it, they win by saying, here's a problem, my job as a politician and as a campaigner is to try to make that problem even worse and to make you scared about that problem and to then persuade you that I'm the only person who can help you deal with that problem.
I think that really oversimplifies what populism is. I mean, what we see across Europe and in the US is a reaction to income inequality,
I agree
stagnant wages, concerns, legitimate or not, about change and cultural change.
Yeah, populism isn't the answer.
I'm not saying it's the answer, I'm saying, but populism is not just emotion, right?
No.
There are people who are hurting all over.
Yeah, but Donald Trump. But you're illustrating my point. The idea that Donald Trump is the answer to the hurt of working people.
Of course he's not, but
it's
I mean,
absurd.
but
that's how he won.
There's something real going on, and he captured and reflected he is not the answer. And as I said earlier, if you look at the policies he's promoting, they're actually going to hurt the very people very directly.
As is Brexit.
Absolutely. But what is really interesting is that there's some pretty, I think, compelling analysis that shows that since the rise of Trump and his election, people who are against that kind of populism are actually doing better. So Macron, yes, he has a certain personality. He was brave, speaking in English about climate change, but he also was anti-Trump. I think that the vote against, or I should say, against May was a stay vote. Again, against this kind of Trump, if you look at other elections in Europe. So I think it's actually quite heartening in some ways. I think we're seeing an actual, even though Trump is disheartening in of itself, the reaction to him around the world and the leadership that Europe has taken is actually pretty heartening.
Let me put the question to Christopher Pyne. Do you fear the political landscape changing, as our questioner has suggested this evening, in that dramatic way?
I've been told that the political landscape is changing about 1,000 times over the last quarter of a century, and
has a bit.
And I've just seen, but it hasn't changed that much.
You just said you had 5 prime ministers.
We have. That's not the. That's a change of prime ministers.
Okay.
Has the political landscape
but you
changed
suggested that
much?
was a change to what you're normally used to.
There are 150 members of the House of Representatives. There are still only 5 independents, which goes to the point that Alastair made. In a parliamentary democracy, especially in our country, with compulsory preferential voting,
good on you.
There is an inherent stability in the system, which has meant that only Labor and Liberal have basically governed for 117 years. It's either been Labor or non-Labor. It's very stable. And what happened in the UK...
You don't think, can I just jump in? You don't think we'll ever move to... well, we have, had minority and, governments and governments hanging by a thread in the lower house. I mean...
But that wasn't 75 independents and then, 35 Liberals and 30 Labor.
But it could not head in that direction in your mind?
No, absolutely not. I don't think that'll happen because we have this preferential compulsory voting. So an unhappy Liberal voter has still got to turn up, and when they vote between 7 candidates or 6 candidates or 9 candidates, do they put Labor ahead of me if they're unhappy with me? And my experience has been over 9 elections, they don't. They might vote for everybody else until they get to Labor, but they know how the system works. We're a very sophisticated electorate. They know how the system works, and they tend to know that if I put Labor ahead of Christopher, they get the vote. So I won't. I'll show my unhappiness by voting for everybody else. And in 150 seats, well, I hope they don't do that very often. But in 150 seats, we still only have 5 independents in the lower house, which forms government. And even in the Gillard minority government, there was still a vast majority of Labor members in that government and 3 independents. So.
Yeah, but then you're battling with a hell of a Senate.
Now, the media loves the idea that there's constant political change and it really sells papers, but the public are very stable.
This is a question from our audience this evening.
I'm answering the question.
It's not from the media, though.
I'm answering
Grahame.
the question.
Australia's been well served by a strong 2-party system, but it is fracturing a bit. And, the electorate has given us a Senate at the moment, which is quite a difficult Senate to work with when you've got, the Nick Xenophons and the Pauline Hanson. So this government, which is still, part of the party system, but it has to deal in the Senate with everything. You can have a whole degustation of policies and whatnot that you think are fantastic, but it's still got to be washed through. In fact, both Senator Xenophon and Senator Hanson have to agree to anything before it comes law.
And we're getting
that is different. That is different. And so far, the government has actually done extremely well with those people. And God bless those independents at the moment because things are being done.
Bless them.
But I would hate to...
All of them.
I would hate our country to go much further, where it does really splinter and you end up with moronic sort of systems like the Italians and whatnot have, where they've got to have an election every 6 months because nobody can form a government.
Oh, hang on, the Italian comparison doesn't stand so much anymore. What's been going on in Australia? It used to be a good one, but not so much now. We should hear from Clare on this one.
Well, I have a different view to Chris. I am actually quite concerned about what we see in the sense that there seem to be, and on the evidence there clearly are, a much larger number of Australians at each election who are turning away from the major parties. And we see that in the rise of Pauline Hanson and a whole lot of other minor parties around the country. Now, as to whether this is going to fundamentally change the shape of our political system, I think that's up to political parties to determine. What we're hearing here is there is clearly a group of Australians that don't feel their needs are being met by the mainstream system. There is widespread concern in the Australian community that politicians are not serving their interests, that we're only up there in Canberra looking out for ourselves. But I think there's a community of people who are saying that they're concerned about the way the country's going and some of the fundamental things that they feel have been kind of quintessentially aspects of Australian citizenship. Things like home ownership, like having a secure job, are actually things that they feel may not be available to them and their children, and we need to address those concerns.
OK, now I'll let you know that on July 24, Q&A is going to be in Melbourne for a high school special with an audience of Year 11 students. We've started recruiting the audience, but we're also looking for students who can join the panel, answer questions and debate the issues. So do you have what it takes to mix it on Q&A with our political leaders? You'd cream them. You should easily do it. Go to the Q&A website now to register and to show us what you've got. Now, the next question tonight comes from Paul Grennan.
The Trump White House seems to survive scandal after scandal by attacking many of the institutions that make democracies work. The legal system, the free press, even law enforcement. Is there a danger to democracy itself if this kind of political strategy seems to be working somewhere else?
Anna Greenberg, we'll start with you.
Well, certainly it poses an existential threat to democracy, but what's interesting is how, and important is how robust American institutions are. Take the media, for example. He calls them the enemy of the American people, right? I mean, which is sort of an astonishing thing to say, and yet if you look at the major news outlets in the US, there's never been more people subscribing. They've never done better reporting. If you look at the institutions of law enforcement and the judiciary, the number of leaks that have come out of, the FBI, for example, about things that are going on inside those departments, and not just about Russia, but about things that have to do with law enforcement, criminal justice reform. There is a pushback against his assault on democracy that is encouraging. And while obviously we have to work as hard as we can to defend against his threat to democracy, it is pretty amazing to see the kind of response in the institutions that make up our democracy.
Christopher Pyne.
Well, I think our institutions are very robust in the Western world, and those countries that have been lucky enough to have the inheritance of the Westminster system and the British regard for the rule of law. I'm a Republican, actually, in terms of, the monarchy, but I do respect the fact that Australia, the Anglosphere countries like Britain...
This guy should be in the Labour Party.
Britain, United States, Canada... That's what other people are saying.
Have I intruded on private property?
Welcome in. Go right ahead.
Something of a clanger.
Sorry.
Because it's not true. I've been in the little place since I was 17, just for the record. So now you've thrown it. But the Anglosphere countries like Canada and, of course, now India, which, of course, has got those traditions and institutions, the public service being one of them, I think they're very robust. And the judiciary and the democracy and the one vote, one value, they do tend to survive governments. And governments, politicians come and go, cabinet ministers even, prime ministers, but the institutions do continue. And there's tumult in the United States, there's no doubt about that, but the institutions will continue, politicians will change, and the public will see through all of the politicians eventually and decide we know when change needs to happen.
Just a very quick follow-up, if I can, because you could argue that what the three government MPs did recently with their criticism of the Victorian Supreme Court actually represents exactly that kind of attack that Paul was mentioning, and they had to apologise for that. So is that the beginnings of that kind of attack on those democratic institutions that Paul is actually worried about?
Well, shock jocks in the media have been attacking the judiciary for decades in Australia.
Equally unhelpful, some would argue.
For perceived failings on the part of the judges and sentencing in particular.
Yeah, but these are elected government officials who actually make the laws that the judges have to enact.
And we've had a kind of race to the bottom, of course, in terms of sentencing over the last many decades, as we have heavier and heavier sentences and keep people in jail for longer and longer and longer. But I don't see the crime rate changing dramatically as a consequence. Those three ministers have all apologised on Friday. And as far as I'm aware, that matter is now closed, and I certainly don't want to be the person who opens another new front for the government tonight on Q&A. Trying to recover from the last one.
Yes, we might let you off the hook.
I should mention,
you don't hate me that much.
I should mention, by the way, you made me think of this. I mean, one of the most interesting things about what's been happening in the courts now is they're actually using the president's own words in Twitter, in particular, attacking individual judges, attacking court decisions, and he is having decisions go against him, for example, on his immigration ban, because of the things he has said about the judiciary. So again, these institutions support themselves over time.
Yeah. Graham Morris.
I think there are many of us who hope that the Trump experiment works. But at the moment, with his antics, and also one of the problems with the UK Prime Minister is that our two best mates are losing some of their authority. And in the US, that is because of the antics of the president. Now, we hope that some of these attacks are simply defence mechanisms, and it's shown with some of his explanation that he's actually right and some of these accusations against him are wrong. But at the moment, I think most people around the world are surprised, and I think it is awkward for us because our two best mates for a long time are starting to look a bit chaotic and a bit fragile.
Alastair?
And that starts with the president.
I mean, look, Trump is we've got to hope that Trump is an aberration. But he might not be. You see, I mean, I did an interview with my old boss, Tony Blair, for GQ recently, and I actually said to him, and he thought I was going over the top.
Dropper.
We all hoped he was.
Listen, you're determined to get revenge now, aren't you? Two can play this game.
He actually does have that name to drop, of course.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I was discussing it with the Queen the other night. I made that up. But I made the point. I said that Hitler, he took a few years before he started to go for journalists and judges. Trump did it in week 1. And I'll tell you, the thing that fascinates me about Trump in America, I mean, the Twitter stuff, to be honest, I've stopped even looking. I can't be bothered anymore. But I'll tell you that what still is an endless fascination to me is this bizarre relationship with Putin, who he's never met. And I'll tell you what I think it's about. I think Trump is one of those people who sees... He's got himself, he's gone through business, he's got his empire, he's then become president of America, which is quite an achievement for anybody, not many do it. And he sees the world as something that big guys carve up between them. And he looks at Putin and he's jealous. Because Putin does have control of the media, he does have control of his parliament, he doesn't allow opposition. And I think that's the model that Trump is basing it on. So we've actually got to hope that the American institutions do stand up to it. But look what was one of the first things he did? He's already wheedling away with the courts.
But Russian democracy is hardly established in the way US
no, I'm
or
not
other...
saying it is, but
right.
the institutions have to show... I think you're seeing the signs of them doing it.
Absolutely.
But listen, if he won another election, that's why your party has got to get its act together. Because if he wins another election, he can do all sorts of stuff with a second term.
Very, very quick follow-up from Grahame, just before we move on to Clare, if that's OK, because I noticed your face as you were listening then to Alastair, and as someone who clearly had high hopes for Donald Trump, what do you think of what Alastair's just said there about this maybe being an aberration or not?
Well, I don't know about the Putin thing. Slightly bizarre to me that you've been running him out of too many focus groups or something.
Putin? Well, how do you explain his admiration for Putin, who's fundamentally opposed to American interests? How do you explain that?
Well, the CIA reckons he's got something on him, so that...
I don't know. I mean, you know, I don't think you can dismiss it because that is where... And I'll tell you, it affects you as well because your thing about America and Britain becoming weaker, America and Britain, our traditional role in geopolitics has been actually to be the powers that stick together and face up to big threats like Russia. And now you've got Trump, who's basically saying, come on in, and you've got Theresa May, who's fundamentally weakened. So I don't think you should dismiss it.
Claire?
Well, I'm amazed to hear that you had high hopes for Trump because I think it was obvious to so many of us.
That shows you've got bad judgment on two fronts.
Well, that's a little harsh. I wouldn't put it that way, but
Okay.
I certainly think that what's happening was what was always going to happen, and that is a government that's got absolute issues right to the core. But I think Paul's question was really about whether this sort of breakdown of institutions is possible in other countries like Australia. And I just make the point that one of the things that has made Trump so attractive to many Americans is that they've had a congressional system for a long time that just isn't working properly. And I think that we need to take a lesson from that about the functioning of our own parliament. We have really good institutions in this country, really good institutions by global standards, but they're institutions that we're not always good about updating with the times. And we have a parliament that I think is atrophied, that has a model of decision making that I think belongs well in the past. And I think there's a lot of things we can do to change the way the parliament works to make it more inclusive and allow the many people in this country who are interested in politics to engage with politicians more.
But whatever we think of Trump, I think Graham's fundamental point, which I agree with, is that we need America to be strong. We need America to succeed. And he is the president for the next 4 years. And we need America to be the strongest nation in the world because they are our great ally and they are the bulwark for freedom around the world. So we do want the American institutions, to get back to your original question right from the beginning, to be strong. And one of those institutions is the presidency. So we're all willing that institution to succeed. I think that's Graham's point.
All right, let's move on. And remember, you can join the discussion on Twitter and on Q&A Extra on Facebook Live and ABC News Radio straight after this program. Our next question now comes from Alana Melville.
My question is to Alastair Campbell. As someone who has lived with mental health issues in a high-profile position, do you think that mental health is still a taboo subject that must be concealed to maintain professional credibility?
No, I don't. And it's one of the reasons why I talk a lot about my own. I've had psychosis, I've had addiction issues, I still get very bad depression. I think there is still massive stigma and taboo attached to it. And I think it's wrong. I actually think this is an area where Australia should take a lot of pride and a lot of credit for the. I think Beyond Blue, for example, is one of the best organisations I've ever seen in this field. They do terrific work, and I think it's brilliant that Julia Gillard's, who, by the way, I thought led a good government, is the head of it. But I think that I had no choice in a way, because I was a journalist before I started working for Tony Blair, and all the media knew about my issues. And when I moved to work for Tony Blair, they started to write about it. And I could have sort of said, listen, this is none of your business, and this is all the past and whatever. But I just decided there and then to be open, and I've never, ever regretted it. And I think we're only going to change this if we understand that we all have mental health, just as we all have physical health. Hands up anybody in this room who's never had to see a GP, a general practitioner, for physical health. Why do we assume that we're all going to go through the whole of our life without having mental health problems? We all have bad days. Now, sometimes it tips into illness. And I think until we can see it in exactly the same way as we see physical illness, the stigma and the taboo is going to be there. And we've all got to do what we can to break it down.
I know you had a very direct conversation with Tony Blair at the beginning of all this, and you told him all about the circumstance and your experience and your mental health, and he just wasn't bothered by it. He said, oh, look, I'm not bothered. I can deal with all of that. Did that surprise you?
No, not really, no, because, I mean, I knew him very well anyway.
But from someone who's about to, to take on this job, to have his key member of his personnel like that, I mean, I would imagine some other people might have really balked at that idea.
They might have done, but I don't see why they should. You see, because how I look at it. Look, so I had a breakdown in the 80s. I get depression. I take medication for it. It doesn't make me. And here's the other thing. I think that a lot of the best people in the world in history. Lincoln was your greatest president. He was a depressive. Winston Churchill was our second best ever Prime Minister after Tony. And
it's all right, Grahame, we'll come to you.
He was a depressive.
Where's Putin?
It's not his mental health I worry about. So I think I wish more employers were like that.
Anna Greenberg, is it still a devastating diagnosis if you hope to seek high office in America?
Well, I think we're past the days of Eagleton and that sort of destroying a presidential run, but it's still the case in the U.S. that it's treated unequally. Under the Affordable Care Act created by President Obama, they instituted mental health parity. That is something that's being scaled back with the current Republican assault on Obamacare. And I fear, frankly, particularly with the rise of opioid addiction, the epidemic in our country, for what's going to happen to mental health under this president and this Republican Congress.
I actually wanted to, Graham Morris, just put to you, and I guess Christopher Pyne as well, that there have been some high-profile politicians in this country who have been very open and honest about the black dog, for example, Andrew Robb in particular. Does it, in this country, does it depend on the personality of the person to sort of to communicate that well and to have that not turn into a big issue for them and to help remove that stigma?
Yeah, too right. But I think it's important that people at that level do explain that they have problems, and then people can say, "Hey, it's just not me." But I tell you, my most memorable experience in life, and I was up in Queensland, and the government I just helped the government give $6 million to an organisation called the Endeavour Foundation, and it looks after really, really handicapped kids and people, really, really severely handicapped. And this little old lady came up to me, and she had two sons aged about 40, really big men, and she was tiny. But they had the mental capacity of about a 7-year-old. And she said to me, "Mr. Morris," and she couldn't leave the room without these two big men getting really upset. And she said, "Mr. Morris, thank you for helping us getting the money, but tell me, when am I allowed to die?"
Golly.
And you think, what is going to happen to these two big blokes when Mum, who spent her entire life looking after these fellas, what happens to them? And you think, what a magnificent woman. And we talk about knighthoods and everything. She ought to get 7 of them.
Well, just, very quickly, I think we do mental health much better in Australia than we did 10, 20, 15 years ago. I was actually responsible for mental health in the Howard government, and I created Headspace, which some people might know, the Youth Mental Health Initiative. That was when I was a parliamentary secretary, in fact, before I was a minister. And we have Beyond Blue. And the federal government jumped into mental health in a big way at the end of the Howard government, and to the credit of the Rudd-Gillard governments, and since then we've continued to do that. And obviously the tendency is when you become a government, you think everything the previous government did was terrible, so we're going to change it. Rudd and Gillard didn't do that in mental health, and we've got a long way to go, but we are much better off today than we were 15 years ago. And John Brogden, Andrew Robb, high-profile cases in sport, they're really important because, as Alastair's pointed out, it's so much better for everybody else with a mental health issue, even if it's just a nascent issue, to think, I can see that there are people out there who can function perfectly well with this particular illness.
My big worry in governments at the moment is that the campaign for awareness is winning, certainly winning here, and it's winning in Britain as well. And I worry sometimes that's seen as a substitute for the services that you need. More and more people report possibly being symptoms, but they find the treatment's not there and they end up in a worse place.
It's critically important not for politicians not to tick the box and think, I've done that now because I got a great media story out of it. It's critical that it be reached right through to the grassroots. And we are doing that, though. We're spending a lot of money on mental health. As long as we're spending it wisely, that's the critical point.
Let's move on to our next question, and tonight it comes from Peter Lynn Relton.
Thank you, panel. Federal politicians are about to receive a 2% pay rise and a 2% tax cut, at the same time as many of Australia's lowest paid workers have had their penalty rates slashed. My husband is one of those whose pay has been cut. He works as a casual for a major hardware chain, and we rarely spend a weekend together. We have to pay our mortgage and cover basic expenses. As a teacher, I work longer hours than most people are aware. Indeed, when I calculate the hours I work, I earn much less per hour than most would expect. Unlike Australia's politicians, low-paid workers do not have the benefit of retiring with a gilded nest egg, or receive taxpayer-funded entitlements such as helicopter rides or family holidays. Nor do low-paid workers receive gifts and donations from corporations or foreign governments. So my question is, do many politicians care that they are largely viewed as callous egotists, feathering their own nests, rather than working for the benefit of the common folk who make up their constituencies?
Clare O'Neill, we'll start with you.
Well, firstly, Peter Lynn, can I just thank you for your question? And I can only imagine how frustrating it is for people in your position who are seeing that on Sunday, in fact, this penalty rate cut will take effect. 700,000 of the poorest paid people in the country are going to have an effective pay cut. On that same day, millionaires in this country are going to get a tax break and politicians are going to get a pay rise. So I can just imagine that everyone in this audience and a lot of people watching at home are just fed up with this. Does it worry me that a lot of people have a really bad perception of politicians? It really worries me, not because I care that people don't like me, but because there's got to be a level of trust between the people that I represent, that when I go off to Canberra, I'm acting in their best interests. And if there are vast numbers of Australians who just don't believe that, then there's a fundamental issue with our democracy. So this is crucially important. I think there's a lot we can do to try to improve the perceptions that people have about our politicians.
Well, you could not take the pay rise.
We could not take the pay rise, yeah. I mean, we don't set our own salary, as you probably know, Virginia, so I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think that I should get to decide how much I get paid. This is a decision of an independent body. But I think there are some big things that we can do to try to restore your faith in democracy. And one of them you've pointed out is about this issue with expenses. You're absolutely right. Like, this business of someone taking a helicopter ride between Melbourne and Geelong, it just is so emblematic of what's wrong with our political process. I think we need to fix that. I think we need to have a
Or a foreign donation,
yeah, exactly,
as Sam Dastyari took.
Yeah, well, as you know, also, it's Labor Party policy to ban foreign donations in Australia, and that's a part of a whole suite of other reforms. But I'm not being glib about this. These are really important issues, and donations and expenses, they're touchstones for Australians about this perception that politicians are not acting in their best interests, and we just have to get together and fix them, because the problem you're identifying is a real threat to us doing our job.
Christopher Pyne, how did Peter Lynn's story make you feel?
Well, I'm very disturbed for Peter Lynn that she feels the way that she does, and the reality is that politicians have deliberately taken out of their own hands the decisions around our remuneration. So the Remuneration Tribunal froze MPs' salaries for the last 2 years, so this is the first increase in 3 years, and that's a matter for the Remuneration Tribunal. I've been in Parliament 24 years. I've never made a submission to the Remuneration Tribunal in my entire life. It's this government, with the support of the Labor Party, that's introduced the independent authority to manage all of the MPs' expenses so that they meet a community standard and so that they're fair. And I think one of the mistakes over the course of many decades, not recently, that the politicians made was rather than increasing their salary in a transparent way and saying this is what we think we should be paid, or the Remuneration Tribunal thinks we should be paid, tried to find a whole lot of other ways to increase our remuneration without having to have a salary increase. And that's why you ended up with all of these anomalies, which the independent authority is now removing. And of course, a helicopter ride was a mistake. And Speaker Bishop paid a pretty high price. Her career came to an end. She resigned. She was defeated in pre-selection. She left Parliament. So there was certainly a consequence for a judgment decision. So it's not like every politician's taking helicopter rides. I've never been in a helicopter on the taxpayer, I can assure you.
Sorry.
Yes. So that's one of the examples of the ways that MPs tried to find ways of increasing their remuneration. Now, happily, the Fair Work Tribunal, the Fair Work Commission, has installed a 3-year transition period for the penalty rates changes. So it's not true that 700,000 people are losing penalty rates. They only affected 2 or 3 awards out of the many awards that pay penalty rates. And Labor certainly isn't purer than the driven snow when they're led by someone who removed the penalty rates for workers in enterprise bargaining agreements when he was the National Secretary of the Labor Party, of the AWU, and took away their penalty rates altogether, like the clean event workers and the theatre mushrooms workers. Rather than getting into that...
Hang on, this is the kind of political bickering I think that people were saying they're sick of.
But,
and that's exactly right.
Very briefly,
I'm
Claire.
not going to get down in the trenches on that. I just say the government is in control of the penalty rate cut. The government is in control of the tax cut that's being given to millionaires. The government is in control of the $65 billion in taxes that is going to be given to big business in this country over the coming decade.
So the reason the tax cut for 180,000 and over, which is not $1 million, so better check the maths, 180,000 is coming in, ended on June 30, is ending on June 30, is because Labor insisted on that when they supported the legislation 3 years ago. They required there to be a 3-year sunset clause, which we agreed to. That's why.
Okay, I want to hear from the questioner. Peter Lynn, you wanted to add something in quickly?
Yeah, well, what I wanted to say is it wrenches my guts because I feel that when we get to the end of a fortnight and we've hardly seen each other and we have very little of our income left, and it's been a long time since either of us have had a pay increase, but we've now suffered a pay cut. And now to hear that you're arguing over this, I really don't care. I'm glad, OK, Bronwyn Bishop is no longer in her position and she suffered greatly, but has she still got her parliamentary pension? Where is she living? What is her mortgage? Can she pay, the rising cost of groceries and electricity? I'm sure she's in a very good position.
OK, Peter Lynn, thank you for that. I actually want to hear from Grahame Morris on this because we're going through for general wages in this country, what is it? Is it the lowest wage growth period since records have actually been kept? I think 1.9% wage increase in the last 12 months in terms of how wages generally are rising. So we're heading towards one of these big moments of, of separation and break between the voting public, the general public and our elected politicians, aren't we, in a moment like this?
And look, I understand the teacher thing. I think the teacher salary is disgraceful. Even in my own family, where you can have people in the financial sector get paid bonuses more than one of my family member does as a basic salary of a teacher, and one is teaching the next generation. So I understand the teacher one. I understand your anger about the penalty rates, but the whole point of reducing the penalty rates is to give a lot more people jobs on weekends. Now, I will defend that. And I also think it's about time some in the business community got off their posteriors and started explaining and started putting people on, because that's what it's all about.
Let me hear from the overseas members as well. Alastair?
The point that Krista was making about expenses, that was Margaret Thatcher did that as well in Britain. That's what led to our expenses scandal with MPs. So basically, she didn't want to give a big pay rise to MPs, but the word went out, listen, get this scam going, that scam going. But I think we've got to be really, really careful about this. Most politicians, in my experience, and I've worked with an awful lot of them, most of them are not motivated by money. And I think it's wrong to take your own anger, which I do understand, and from that build the case that all your politicians are there just feathering the nest, because I don't believe they are. And what happens if that becomes the general conversation about our politicians? What happens is actually you'll find that people just don't want to go near politics, and you do need good people going into politics. So I don't think, and as has been pointed out, they don't set their own salaries. And I'm sure one of the judgments that's made in the setting of a salary for an MP is actually, we need to give them a reasonable standard of living. And here's the other thing, most MPs are separated from their families quite a lot as well. So let's not pretend that politicians live the life of Riley. I don't think most of them do.
I'd like to hear from Anna Greenberg on this too.
I agree that most of the politicians I know and the people I work for are not motivated by money, and they aren't, making tons of money as politicians. But, what I hear in the U.S. is very similar to what you're expressing. And the U.S. political system is completely corrupt because we are driven by political donations, and because political donations drive everything from, who runs, how you run, and how you legislate. you have to have more and more money to be able to even run in the first place, which means over time, our leaders have become much more distant financially and economically from the people they represent. I personally think that the Democratic Party in the U.S. would do a better job dealing with the daily needs of people, the struggles they have to, in the U.S., wages are stagnant as well. We've not gone back to 2007 wages post-recession. We have, healthcare costs, transportation, education, and we don't have a social safety net like you do or Britain does. And so in some ways it's even worse, in the U.S. And what's happening in this Congress is going to make it even worse. But I think the anger is understandable, and at least in the U.S. system, money is everything, and it's created really big gap between voters and electeds, and I understand your anger.
Now remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A tonight, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda, and keep an eye on our Twitter account, RMIT ABC FactCheck, and the Conversation website for the results. I'm sure there won't be a single one that's been aired this evening. We've got time for one last question, and it comes from Adrian Legras.
As Leader of the Opposition, Tony Abbott decided the best process was to oppose everything the government put up. And Bill Shorten seems to have taken that same role on now, and he's become the new Mr No. It seems that with the political parties, more time is spent in scoring points off each other than actually formulating policy. Does our democracy and the mechanism need an overhaul?
Clare and Neil, we'll start with you first.
I'm disappointed that that's your perception of what Labor's doing, because it's not what I see when I go to Canberra. Actually, most legislation goes through the Parliament with the support of the two major political parties, and I can think of one big example, climate change, for example, where Labor is reaching out to the government and trying to find a solution that will give some stability to this policy, which has changed so much from government to government. So, yeah, I don't know if I necessarily agree with how you've characterised that, and I hope that's not how you continue to think about it.
Well, I did want to just jump in and say that in the book that you co-wrote with Labor MP Tim Watts, Two Futures, Australia at a Critical Moment, you said, in many ways, question time has become ground zero of the contempt cycle that's encircled Australian politics, and yet your leader does do this. I mean, he's figured out a couple of set phrases in question time that are just hammered again and again and again, and he blocks and blocks and blocks and does say no, and has taken a leaflet out of the Tony Abbott playbook. So doesn't that cause you some discomfort, given how you believe politics should actually work?
Yeah, so I do think that politics can work quite differently to how it's conducted at the moment, but I don't think there's anyone who's coming to this conversation completely with clean hands. It's more a point about the system. And the point that Tim and I were making in the book is that, for a lot of people in Australia, all they see of Australian politics is question time, where the behaviour is just absolutely abhorrent, and politics is being conducted with a level of aggression and personal contempt that would frankly get people immediately sacked in any other line of work, yet this in politics is presented as the inevitable way to resolve problems. Okay. And I just think that's wrong and it should be done differently.
Time is on the wing, so a few last comments on this, Grahame Morris.
One of the problems is a cynicism in the electorate, particularly in Australia, where we mistrust authority. And if I say to you, I'm going to give you a tax cut, you would say, oh, sure you are. If I say those other bastards are going to increase your taxes and take money off you, you would say, yes, the mongrels. It is the power of the negative. And we would all love to run a positive campaign for 3 years. Nobody's worked out how to do it effectively. It is the power of the negative, and we'd love to put it in the bin, but these sort of people who help run campaigns, you can do it for a week, you can do it for 6 months. You cannot do it in an election campaign.
We'll get to the campaigners in a moment. Christopher Pyne?
Well, your question goes to kind of what I was talking about in the first half of the show, that for the last 10 years there's been a lot of tumult in Australian politics, and it hasn't just been changing leaders, it's been this constant negativity, this anti. And we have to change that. And Malcolm Turnbull is the kind of Prime Minister that does try and explain things to the voters, and often he gets criticised in the media for doing so. And when he explains things to the voters about why we're doing this and why we're doing that, the criticism he gets in the press is he just needs to keep very simple sound bites, because that's all that people want to hear. Now, he gets criticised for trying to explain things. He gets criticised for being, too negative. But the truth is, he's trying to change politics, and I think we need to support him in doing that by embracing the fact that he wants people to know why we make policy decisions, which he's tried to explain both in question time but also particularly in the media and on shows like this.
Anna, there's not much reaching across the aisle in America.
No, but this seems to me that is the power of partisanship and ideological polarization. It's not just playing politics. It's certainly in 1994 when Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House, said, "I will only bring bills to the floor that get a majority of the majority," meaning a majority of Republicans, meaning I don't need one Democratic vote to pass legislation. That set the tone that we experience today. Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate Majority Leader in 2008, said, "My job is to prevent Barack Obama from passing any legislation when he is president." And so it is, pure partisanship and ideological polarization. At least in the US, the time of parties working together is over.
Alastair Campbell.
You've got to remember that your system and our system are kind of founded on the idea that the debates taking place are instead of killing each other. The dispatch box is just over 2 sword lengths, and so it's better that they kind of have a go at each other than that they're killing each other. So let's start with the positive side of it.
That's a pretty low bar to start.
Yeah, it's very low bar.
Yeah.
But I go back to a point I've been trying to make throughout the evening, is that there is a sense that you sometimes will get the politics that you deserve. And I often think that the political debate, there's 3 sides of a triangle. You've got the politicians, you've got the media, and you've got the public. And these two, the politics and the media, can never really blame the public.
No.
But the public, actually, if you really, really, really wanted this to change, you'd make it change. And I think, why do you all come out and listen to a panel thing like this? Why are people watching tonight? Because actually there is an interest in politics. People are interested. So I think you should give the politicians a bit more slack, and then they actually might start to open up and be a bit more expansive.
You can come on in.
Apart from him. And he's clearly in the wrong party.
We'll be in charge of who gets invited and the way in which they get invited, Christopher Pyne. But I think you deserved and you got a really great conversation tonight. So please thank our panel, won't you? That's all we have time for this evening. Our panellists, Christopher Pyne, Anna Greenberg, Alastair Campbell, Clare O'Neill and Grahame Morris. Thank you. Now remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and former Abbott Government Advisor Terry Barnes. They're taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish here. Next week, Q&A is live from Alice Springs with the local Labor member Warren Snowden, Alice Springs Indigenous Councillor Jacinta Price, businesswoman and Chair of Tourism Central Australia Dale McIver, and the Senior Policy Officer for the Central Land Council, Dr Josie Douglas. Now, unfortunately, no relevant senior government minister could join us in Alice Springs, Christopher, but Maverick Independent Bob Katter, who supports the government in the House of Reps, has agreed to be there, so we're pleased that he can. And I'll be there too, hosting Q&A for a second performance. So until next week's Q&A from the heart of Australia, good night to you all.